comes from the Solar Stewardship Initiative, and we're happy to have with us Rachel Owens, who's the CEO, and she will talk about how to ensure transparency and traceability across the global PV supply chain. Rachel, great you're here.
Thanks so much, Mikhail. Just to say, I'm having a slight problem sharing my screen, so I don't know if your colleagues could share the presentation I sent earlier. If not, I can, it won't. Yes, no, it's working now. It's all good. It's working now.
If it doesn't, just let us know and we step in. Huh?
Perfect. Yeah, I think it should. Sorry, hold on 1 second. I was trying to practice it before, but it wouldn't let me. Okay. Here we go. Voila. Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, just click on presentation mode and then.
Oops. Voila. Okay, perfect. And you can see that okay? Yes? Yes, good. Okay. So thanks so much for having me today, and really good to be part of this discussion. And I've really enjoyed the presentation so far. My name is Rachel Owens, and I'm the CEO of the Solar Stewardship Initiative. I joined about 6 months ago and have a background in kind of human rights and the climate crisis. So I've been really interested in the discussions. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what the Solar Stewardship Initiative is, just as a reminder. I'm sure many people online are aware of us, but just a bit of an update on who we are, what we've been up to, and what the future looks like for the Solar Stewardship Initiative. So the Solar Stewardship Initiative actually just celebrated its 3rd year anniversary. It is a global accountability initiative specifically for the solar sector. We are a multi-stakeholder initiative, which means that we bring together a very diverse group of stakeholders to tackle some of these issues around having high ESG standards and traceability standards for the sector. So we bring together the leading manufacturers in the PV supply chain, investors, buyers, international finance, trade associations, civil society, and human rights experts. And those different stakeholders are very much present throughout our governance. So in terms of our board, for example, which I'll explain later, there's equal representation between industry and non-industry. We in the SSI are really aiming to have industry-wide harmonized standards. So that's really about having one standard that's applicable for manufacturers that is aligned with international standards. So, for example, ILO standards, the UN guiding principles, the OECD standards, and also that it has this multi-stakeholder buy-in. I think one of the most powerful things about the SSI really is this multi-stakeholder approach. So having both buyers, manufacturers sitting down with investors, sitting down with civil society, and all saying, how can we have the highest standards in the sector? Another really key part of what the SSI delivers is third-party independent robust audits. And that's really about showing to the market that we have credible standards and that those standards go through assessments and then certification. This also really aims to reduce the audit burden on manufacturers. Anecdotally, we speak to our manufacturers regularly, and we hear that they're being asked to particularly before the SSI, we're being asked to do hundreds of audits per year with many different standards. And the idea with the SSI is really to ensure that you have one audit and one standard, or two standards, the ESG and the traceability standard, that you're expected to comply with. And then that is then recognized by buyers, investors, and international financial institutions. Also, I'll go in to talk about our standards, but they're also very broad. So they cover, we just heard from Trina talking about their really exciting work around low carbon and looking at carbon emissions. The Solar Stewardship Initiative covers environmental, social, and governance aspects, as well as really looking at the traceability aspects of the supply chain, which I'll dive into more. And so our mission is obviously to build that confidence that solar is clean, is rights respecting, is reliable, and really to look at reducing some of those ESG harms. So as I mentioned, we're a multi-stakeholder initiative, and that means that even in our board, we had a new board which was launched in May, and we're really bringing together all the key stakeholders in the sector to make decisions on, and the board is the kind of ultimate decision maker on, what the standard will be, who becomes a member, what the future looks like for the organization, what areas we should move into, the rigor of our auditing. So really that's what our governance structure looks like. We have our board, which is our ultimate decision maker, but we also have our working groups where our SSI members, who are, as I mentioned, their buyers, their manufacturers, are really active. We have one on procurement, for example, one on traceability, and then we have our General Assembly, which brings together all of our company members as well. And then we have our stakeholder advisory group, where we engage regularly with civil society, with academia, with international organizations such as the OECD, as well as development finance institutions such as the EIB, EBRD, and the IFC. Actually, Guido, who's joining later, sits on our board. So in terms of membership and coverage, the SSI is really already moving the market. Our members include many of the leading Chinese producers, as well as some of the European manufacturers. And collectively, SSI and members cover about 70% of the global solar module manufacturing capacity, which is really exciting. And we hope to really expand that further upstream. We've had our first in the last year since I think my colleague Alexia joined the last conference last year. We've had our first polysilicon manufacturers joining, which is really exciting, and we will be having our first polysilicon assessments being conducted in the next couple of months. So really, we've also had many additional buyers, particularly due to engagement in the EU and UK, additional buyers joining, as well as investors, and then of course increased engagement with the development finance institutions as well, who are becoming ever more interested in the SSI and increasingly endorsing the SSI as the kind of the standard for the sector. So this is what our membership looks like at the moment. We have, as I said, a wide range of the leading manufacturers, the buyer members, but there's so much more coverage that we could do in terms of increasing our membership. So we're really looking to increase, particularly in the upstream and further downstream in the PV supply chain. But also we have association members, so Solar Energy UK, Solar Power Europe, and the Global Solar Council. Many of these trade associations were really important in the building of the initiative from the beginning. So what are our standards? I always say that the SSI is both a standard setter, but also commissions the third-party audits. So when we look at what the standards are, as I mentioned, all of our standards are aligned with international standards. So that means as a manufacturer or as a buyer looking to buy from an SSI certified site, you have the confidence that our standards are very much aligned with those international standards, as well as the regulatory developments that we are seeing in the EU and other jurisdictions. So the ESG standard covers around, there are about 100 different requirements in that standard, and they cover governance, business ethics, environment. So for example, we cover scope 1 and 2 and mapping of scope 3, human rights and labor rights, and really looking at how the standard can kind of really look at that site level production and look at all of the details around that site. At the moment, actually, sorry, this should be updated. We have 12 sites that have been certified, and that represents about 95 to 100 gigawatts of production capacity. In terms of your certification against this standard, you can either get gold, silver, or bronze, or obviously not pass the certification, and that's all dependent on whether you have major or minor non-conformities. Any major non-conformity would mean a fail for the certification, but depending on the level of minor non-conformities, that depends on what level of certification you get. And this standard, the ESG standard, was published in October 2023. And as I mentioned, we've already got 12 sites certified to an amount of around 95 gigawatts of production capacity. We have modules, cells, and wafers that have been certified. And then we're also, as I mentioned, starting our first ESG polysilicon assessments. The Supply Chain Traceability Standard was published at the end of last year, and we're starting our first assessments this year. We've got, I think, around 26 assessments that are due either this year or the beginning of next year, and we hope to have some of our first certifications according to the traceability standard by quarter one, quarter two next year. And again, you've got that gold, silver, bronze in terms of what the certification looks like in terms of the assessment criteria. The Supply Chain Traceability Standard, really important that it covers all the way to quartz mining, and obviously, what we really are trying to achieve here is that there's confidence in the traceability of those products. So, a consumer buying in Germany or in Poland can be confident that that solar panel that they're buying has been traced all the way back to mining. I would say that particularly with the traceability, we still have some progress to make. And I think partly that's about the SSI really becoming more well-known and more strongly adopted across the upstream, but it's also about us really putting into practice this traceability standard and ensuring that we can enhance the traceability and the transparency, particularly from polysilicon down to mining. So, I've already kind of mentioned this, but good to kind of summarize the kind of three tools of accountability that the SSI offers is ESG and traceability standard, as I mentioned, the third-party audit. So we have 7 internationally recognized assessment bodies who we have spent the last 3 years training and undergoing exams, and they're really now, fulfilling those requirements in terms of that third-party robust audit. And we're also going to be next year opening up our assessment process to potentially more assessment bodies. But we do really feel that we have the capacity already in terms of the number of assessors trained to be able to conduct the number of audits that are being required. And as I mentioned, we've already got 12 sites certified, but the number of assessments is going to be really ramping up over even this month and the coming months of the year, but also into next year. And we should start to see, obviously, depending on how those assessments go, a real ramping up in terms of the number of sites that are certified. And just a reminder that all of this information is available on our website, and there's transparency around which sites are certified and a summary document of that certification decision and any areas for improvement. And then I already mentioned the multi-stakeholder governance, which is really, really key in terms of integrity and credibility of the initiative. So I think just important to kind of talk about the different stages of kind of membership and certification and what the differences are. So when a company joins SSI, that's really at the kind of membership commitment stage. So as I mentioned, we have manufacturers, we have buyers, developers, installers, and investors as members of the SSI. And what happens is you commit to the SSI principles, which are available on our website. And that's really about advancing responsible practices throughout the solar supply chain. And it's really about that commitment and that participation in the initiative, which is kind of really important. public demonstration of your commitment to these issues. But if you are just a member, that does not mean that you can claim to be SSI certified company. We do not do SSI certification at a company level. We do it site by site. So then if you're a manufacturer, you put forward within the first 2 years at least 2 sites. If you only have 1 site, then you put forward 1 site to be certified, and that's within the first 12 months. And that has to be against both the ESG and the traceability standard. What I'll go on to talk about, what we've agreed recently at the SSI board is also targets in terms of the number of sites that manufacturers will need to undergo assessment and be SSI certified by certain dates, but I'll explain that a bit later. And so really, what the kind of the crux of the SSI is this site certification, and that's where a full audit has been undertaken, including all triangulation of information, unsupervised conversations with workers, and of course a reminder that the SSI will only do audits in areas or in factories where we have full access, and we can really or the third-party auditors can really undertake those audits in a free and accessible manner. Just a quick mention about the kind of regulatory landscape, which is, ever changing for those of you that follow this in detail, and some of the kind of factors which the solar sector need to be cognizant of. So what the SSI is really also doing is helping companies kind of navigate this quite complex, landscape of ESG due diligence regulations. As an example, in the EU, we have the EU Forced Labour Regulation, which is now passed and will be coming in 2027. And that will be really important for solar buyers and manufacturers to be ready for that. The SSI is very much a tool to help companies prepare for that by ensuring that your supply chains are meeting high ESG and traceability standards. We're also going to be working with EU institutions to better understand what documentation will be required by the EU to implement that legislation, and really trying to position the SSI as a key tool both for EU institutions and companies to implement that legislation. There's also the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is quite a mouthful, and that's basically a legislation which requires all companies to do, or companies over a certain threshold to do due diligence along their supply chains. Again, the SSI is a really great tool to help the solar sector prepare for that. Our assessment is that the solar sector will be considered high risk, and that it will still be required to do full value chain due diligence, even if there is some kind of political and legislative changes happening to that legislation. There's also the Corporate Reporting Directive, and then obviously national legislation that exists in many countries, and many countries around the world that are considering both due diligence legislation and increased ESG reporting. One thing that we're working particularly with the Global Solar Council on is really globalizing the SSI. And that means both working with countries and companies of emerging producer countries. So for example, India, but also looking at those countries that want to be importing solar and want to ensure they have high standards. And that's looking at that globally. So I'm really excited to have conversations with many of the colleagues and companies on the line to think about how we can collectively globalize the SSI. So we're going to do a slight deep dive on the Supply Chain Traceability Standard. So, what is the kind of problem that we're trying to tackle with this? In 2020 and 2021, there were these reports and allegations of forced labor in the solar supply chain, but also, other ESG risks which the solar sector needed to mitigate. So, there's traditionally, and I think this situation is improving, but still remains an issue around lack of transparency and traceability, which of course are two slightly different interrelated concepts. The traceability standard is really about going from modules back to mines and ensuring that we can really trace where the products have come from. And then also obviously ensuring that those ESG standards are high at every stage along that solar PV supply chain. So obviously it's about having fair working conditions. We were listening to some of the conversations around the climate crisis. This idea of a just transition is also incredibly important. What we're seeing in many countries that are kind of importers of solar panels and of solar technology is that there's some political backlash around this issue of kind of forced labor. And what the solar sector needs to do together with the SSI is show that there is a solution to this and that we are collectively tackling this issue. Traceability Standard, as I mentioned, was launched in December. And then, as I mentioned, we've got our assessments coming up and hopefully the first certifications early next year. So just quickly, I've already mentioned some of this. We have 12 sites certified, and that's all available on our website. We've also got manufacturer targets adopted. More information, again, available on our website. The top line of that is that by 2028, 100% of our members' module capacity shipping to Europe and UK would need to be SSI certified. And that's very much aligned with the legislation that I mentioned before. We've also launched a digital platform, which is coming in the next couple of weeks. And that's a really exciting platform, which will be growing over the coming months and years to have a lot more visibility along the supply chains, around assessment, around progress. And that's a platform available for our member companies. We've also got a buyer's guide, which is a specific guide for buyers, which has been developed in tandem with our members, and that will be launched at the Sustainable Solar Europe event in December in Brussels. We'll also be reviewing our ESG standard next year. And then we've also are in discussions with our board and our members around setting certain buyer targets, which will match the manufacturer targets. So that would be, for example, saying, our buyer members would only buy from SSI certified sites. Many of our buyer members are already setting these kind of targets themselves as a company-wide policy. I think that's it. And there's my details in case you want to get in touch. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Exciting, a lot of developments at the SSI. That's cool. We're running a bit behind time. I think there are two questions in the chat. It would be great if you could address them. And I think one is actually also very interesting because it comes from an inverter manufacturer asking when you would develop beyond modules, the module chain. And there's also another one regarding recycling. Thanks again for your contribution. Very much appreciated.